My name is Brandon and welcome to the debut of my Gotta Play 'Em All series, a show where I'm embarking on the Whale Lord-sized task of playing, reviewing and ranking every single Pokémon game ever released to find out which one is the very best, like no one ever was. Naturally, I'm starting from the very beginning with the games that kickstarted the whole franchise, Pokémon Red and Blue. Now I know technically the Japanese releases of Red and Green are the original games, but I don't speak Japanese and the games are close enough to the Red and Blue versions we got in the West. As everybody probably knows, these iconic games were developed by Game Freak. However, these weren't their first games. The company was founded by the iconic Satoshi Tajiri and Ken Sugimori. Game Freak would develop 7 games including Yoshi on the NES and Mario and Wario on the SNES before finally making it huge with Pokémon. The idea for Pokémon came from Satoshi Tajiri's childhood bug catching hobby, which eventually morphed into the franchise literally everybody in the world knows today. As I alluded to, the release for these games is rather odd. In Japan, they initially released Pokémon Red and Green on February 27, 1996. These games sold like crazy, but they weren't without their issues. Because you couldn't just send out a patch like you can these days, Game Freak actually released a definitive version that fixed a number of issues. This game would be known as Pokémon Blue and was only available via mail order through the CoroCoro magazine in Japan until October of 1999, when it then became available for anyone to purchase. On September 28, 1998, the phenomenon hit North America as Pokémon Red and Blue. These games were based on the Japanese Blue version with the appropriate version exclusives added in. While a smash hit with players, the games also knocked it out of the park with critics. It currently sits on a very handy 88 average on game rankings and is one of only 20 games to ever receive a 10 out of 10 from IGN. But with all of that background history laid out, it's time to get into the meat and bones of the actual games. For the sake of this review, I'll be playing Pokémon Blue. Before I get into my thoughts on the game, I thought I should point out that I won't be going too heavily in depth about how utterly broken these games are. If I did, this review would be insanely long, so I'm just going to include this handy photo that has been around since the beginning of time basically, and it explains the absurdity of Gen 1 better than I ever could. I'll still be bringing up a few examples, but just bear that in mind. So what exactly is Pokémon Red and Blue? Well, they're basically your typical JRPG. You start on a journey, have random battles, face stronger boss characters, and save the day from the bad guys in the end, all while leveling up your party. What set Pokémon apart from the litany of other JRPGs at the time was the creature designs, as well as the catching and trading mechanics. In other JRPGs, the emphasis is on the main party, while the run-of-the-mill enemies were usually quite forgettable. However, here this wasn't the case. The basic run-of-the-mill enemies were your party, as you'd have to catch these enemies to actually progress in the game. Being able to trade between games was also a massive aspect. Nowadays, people have retconned this to make it seem like Game Freak are just greedy bastards. However, that's not really the case. If your first games were Pokémon X and Y, I could understand that feeling, having access to the internet and all. But back then, trading was a huge social aspect of the game, and one of the major reasons the games took off. Whether you were trying to track down one of the version exclusives or were trying to swindle one of the gullible kids into giving you an extra Mewtwo, a whole schoolyard economy popped up around these monsters that is honestly underappreciated these days. You start Red and Blue in a very uneventful fashion. You wake up, your mother basically begs you to leave the house on a journey, and then you just wander into the grass. It's all very rushed and doesn't play out the best, especially for kids. If you jump online today, you'll find countless examples of people who were stuck in Pallet Town because they didn't know that they had to walk into the grass without any Pokémon. And this sort of thing just continues. Pokémon has become known for extensive tutorials these days, so it might be surprising for some of you to hear that this game basically has no tutorials. You get your Pokémon from Professor Oak, get shoved into what is honestly one of the hardest battles in the entire game, and then you're basically left to your own devices. However, despite not offering any formal tutorial, Game Freak still had a genius way of shepherding players through the early stages of the game. Literally every NPC in the beginning of the game is programmed to give you some sort of helpful info about the world of Pokémon. Whether it's about catching, battling, or just the world at large, the first few towns are literally a tutorial, albeit an incredibly cleverly disguised one. This decision is why these games were perfect to replay back in the 90s. The tutorials were always there if you needed them, but if you were a seasoned player, you could breeze by them. While this game design is honestly brilliant, there are a lot of other general things that frustrated or annoyed me. For starters, they don't display the name of the town or route when you cross a border. This is something I had completely forgotten about and had taken for granted in the game's sequels. I've played through Kanto more times than I can count, so it wasn't too much of an issue for me, but I can imagine this would have caused a fair bit of confusion back in the day. On the flip side, it actually gives the town map some genuine use, so it's not too bad. Keeping with the traversal theme, I really didn't miss having a run button. Your character's walking speed isn't really that slow, and if it does bother you, you get the bike so early on that it could never be an issue. What I did have a problem with was the wild encounter rate. You know how everyone memes about constantly being swarmed in tall grass? That's not the case here, well at least not in my experience. I quite literally walked through the entirety of Viridian Forest at one point without encountering a single wild Pokemon. I was dreading all of the Zubat in Mount Moon, but when I arrived there, I actually found myself wishing I was being swarmed. I don't know if I just had insane luck, but it definitely feels like the wild encounter rate is drastically different here. Also extremely annoying is the limited bag capacity. I maxed out my bag by Vermilion City, so from that point onwards I had to play Inventory Management, the video game. Look, in reality it's not the biggest hassle in the world, but it is frustrating having to constantly go back to the PC to dump the gold teeth, so you have room to pick up more important items. Finally, why on earth can you miss your throws when trying to catch Pokemon? Who thought this was a good idea? It's just an annoying mechanic that makes trying to catch legendary Pokemon a chore, rather than a cool experience. Those are just my general loose thoughts on the game though. Now it's time to get down to the nitty gritty and really analyse some specific areas of the game, starting with the Pokémon. I'd wager that every single person watching this video knows that there were 150 Pokemon in the first generation. These 150 were divided into 1 mythical Pokemon, 4 legendary Pokemon, and 146 regular Pokemon. Having essentially 146 Pokemon present is a really solid number on paper, but in reality, I think Game Freak blew it. Of the original 151 Pokemon, 33 of them have the poison typing, and 32 of them have the water typing. These are by far the most dominant types in the Kanto region, with normal being the only other close one with 24. In comparison, the electric type is featured 9 times, fighting type 8 times, ice type 5 times, and ghost and dragon type 3 times. Plain and simple, the type distribution in Kanto is absolutely awful. There is no reason to have so many poison and water types, yet there is literally one family of ghosts and dragons. The abundance of poison types particularly hurts, as it feels like every single wild encounter is a poison type and practically every trainer is carrying one. The type distribution also raises some other design questions. Why on earth would you make the second gym a water type gym when you have over 30 different options to choose from? Wouldn't it make more sense to feature it later in the game to take advantage of that? The Elite Four's type specialties also make no sense. They specialise in Ice, Fighting, Ghost, and Dragon. Only one of these types has more than 6 Pokemon represented in the Pokédex. This creates the weird problem where those so-called specialists don't actually specialise in their type, but I'll get into that more later on. I can only assume these problems arose from the fact that Game Freak had to leave so much content out of Red and Blue due to not being able to fit it onto the cartridge. You can obtain roughly 120 Pokemon per game, which honestly isn't too bad. That's a good chunk of the dex without being made to feel like you're being ripped off. I also finished the game having seen 135 of the 150 Pokemon present, a not too shabby final total, especially for someone who wasn't going out of their way to catch Pokemon other than my actual team. Speaking of catching Pokemon, I really dislike the choice to force players to catch certain amounts of Pokemon at various stages. You can always get by without reaching that total, but it's always a much more pleasant experience if you get whatever Oak's Aid is offering. For example, to get the experience all, you need to catch 50 Pokemon. At this point in the game I had only seen roughly 80 Pokemon. I pretty much needed to have been catching every single thing I came across since the beginning to reach this total. I get that they would have wanted to emphasize the catching elements of the game, but I vastly prefer when Game Freak are more hands-off and let players play in whatever style they want. Overall though, it's hard to argue against these games having brilliantly designed Pokemon. There's a reason they became so iconic, and despite Gen 1 not being my favourite, I'm hard pressed to find more than a handful of Pokemon that I dislike the designs of. Some of them are horribly unimaginative, but they still have a certain charm to them that more than makes up for it. This is probably a good time to bring up the Gen 1 is broken image again, because most of the issues are directly tied to this battle system. For the most part, it's not too bad, and you'll generally not be having any issues. The things you do encounter often will annoy the hell out of you though. In general, the battles feel extremely slow here. After going from the more recent entries back to Blue, it was staggering to see how far the series had come. It was also shocking to remember that from a presentation standpoint, things were a bit of a mess. Not having your Pokemon's experience shown on the battle screen is a major annoyance, as you really never know when it's going to level up. Once it does level up and you're presented with a new move to learn, good luck deciphering whether it's decent or not. I had the power of the internet to help me make these decisions, but in 1998 you weren't given any info about the new move. Replaced your best move with a terrible one? Tough luck, buddy. Move distribution is also a nightmare. For example, I decided I'd catch a Pidgey to give me something serviceable that would also fly me around. I then found out the hard way that Pidgeotto doesn't learn its 4th move until level 21, which seems absurd to me. Issues like this were constantly cropping up through my playthrough. Take Flash for example. It's not a required HM by any means, but it does make traversal a whole lot easier. You'd think something like this would be available on a bunch of Pokemon, right? Wrong. Only 17 Pokemon/evolutionary lines can learn the move. 3 of these Pokemon are legendary, and at least another handful are impossible to catch at the point in the game where you need Flash. In the end, you're basically forced to use one of about 6 specific Pokemon if you want to be able to see where you're going. I'll finish off this section by quickly going into some of the more broken aspects of the battle mechanics that I encountered. Wrap and Minimize are just completely broken, and the fact that it seemed like every second trainer ran these moves made me so angry. On the flip side, good lord did I cheese the hell out of this game. I chose to use a Sand Slash, and by the time it learned Slash I was well aware that I'd basically set the game to auto-win. Critical hits rely on the speed stat in this generation, so I damn near scored a critical hit every time I used Slash. At one point Sand Slash ended up 6 levels higher than any of my other Pokemon purely on accident, just because I could always rely on it when I didn't have a favourable type matchup. In general, this game is very light on story, however it's often remembered fondly for its characters, particularly your rival and Team Rocket. As for any overarching story, it's not really present. The game is honestly more focused on your character making it to the Pokemon League than it is about saving the day or besting your rival. You'll go through long stretches where no story beats occur. Some notable ones happen after the 3rd gym, as well as in between the Pokemon Tower and heading to Saffron City. With that said, let's dive into the important characters we meet on our journey. First up is Blue. I know he's often put on a pedestal, but having revisited this game, I think he's just okay. I do like that he has a bit of previous history with you and that he's legitimately in competition with you, but as a character he's half-baked. Almost every run-in I had with Blue left me feeling underwhelmed. You encounter him 4 times in battle in the first few hours, and then only encounter him 4 more times for the rest of the game before your big climactic fight. These encounters are always so brief because he always jumps straight into battle with you, loses, gives off one sarcastic quip, and then leaves. In some cases where I swept his team, the encounter with him was over in like a minute. I think the biggest problem with Blue is that we never get to encounter him outside of a Pokemon battle setting. There's no downtime where we learn about him as a person, and he gets 0 character development. He's just a slight jerk to you every time you face off until you eventually crush his dreams at the Indigo Plateau and Professor Oak berates him. I guess this is the catalyst for him to change, grow, and become the legendary trainer you end up facing in the Gen 2 games, but I would have liked to have seen some of that development occur before our eyes. In my opinion, this is one of the rare times the Pokemon anime did something better than the games. We actually see Gary go from arrogant toe rag to serious trainer to compassionate and level-headed researcher on screen. In the games, we see Blue act exactly the same in 9 encounters, and then the game ends. While I am being quite critical, there are positives to Blue. For starters, while I did stomp him quite early on, he does become a bit trickier from roughly the Silphco fight onwards. He feels his team out pretty quickly, so these battles at least offer some sort of challenge, and often come at times when you're not expecting it, meaning you might have forgotten to heal up your lead Pokemon, leading to an easy knockout. An extremely underrated aspect of Blue is that his sprite changes throughout the game. He starts out looking like an arrogant child, gets a little more serious, before looking like a genuinely serious trainer in his champion sprite. This is seriously cool and should have been something kept in future games. What about Team Rocket, the evil villains causing minor annoyances throughout Kanto? Well, they're actually kinda awful. They're such nothing villains. For the most part, all they do is commit petty crimes, and they really suffer from not having any overarching plan. What was Giovanni's goals for Team Rocket? I know a lot of people like it because they view Team Rocket as a sort of mafia-style team, but personally I find them lame here. You encounter them 5 times, one of which happens in Cerulean City and is extremely minor, and almost every time it just feels like a minor nuisance. The only time things get real is when you find out they've been murdering Pokemon, but even that doesn't end up going anywhere. Team Rocket also was the birth of the annoying trend of evil teams using the same 3 Pokemon over and over again. Clearing out a Rocket base is not enjoyable when there's no Pokemon variety. To top things off, you only encounter Giovanni 3 times. You end up with no understanding of what he's about or what he wants, and then bam, all of a sudden he's had a change of heart and is disbanding Team Rocket. This will either be confirmed or denied as I continue on with the series, but I'm predicting they'll end up the most forgettable villains in the series. Another important aspect of this game's story is the gym leaders and Elite Four. Because there are so many characters here, I'll try to speed round this. Brock is extremely bland. You'll have a blink and you'll miss it encounter with him at a gym that has no puzzle and a single trainer that can be skipped. If your team contains anything other than just a Charmander, you'll blast through him in 30 seconds. Next up is Misty, and while she's slightly less bland due to the swimming theme going on in her gym, it's still not great. She's another leader that is very easy to beat, and again, there is no gym puzzle here. Lieutenant Surge introduces a gym puzzle, but it's frustratingly bad. At least he has some sort of personality other than I'm the rock guy or I'm the water girl. Erica has quite literally no personality. She's so boring that she's actually asleep when you first encounter her. There's no gym puzzle here, but there are a bunch of trainers, and Erika's Victory Bell and Vileplume provide a nice challenge. Definitely the best so far. Like most of the leaders, Koga doesn't have a personality and becomes infinitely more interesting in Gen 2 just because he has a daughter. This is allegedly a poison gym, yet his underlings refuse to use poison types. They almost all seem to use psychic Pokemon, and one dude is even repping a Sandslash for some reason. Poison type is literally the most prevalent type in this game, so there's no excuse for this buffoonery. Once you reach Koga, you'll probably be shocked as his Pokemon levels are a bit of a jump, which will prove a little bit of a challenge. Also challenging is his Muck, which used Minimize and made it quite literally impossible for me to land a hit on my first attempt. He has a level 43 Weezing too, which was stronger than any of my Pokemon at the time. Unfortunately, he decided to use Self-Destruct when it was his last remaining Pokemon. Sabrina again suffers from Game Freak's decision to give leaders Pokemon that aren't from their specific type. She also doesn't really have a personality other than being psychic, and she was a pushover despite me not really having any super effective moves. Blaine's team is god-awful. It's cool that he has a Rapidash and Arcanine, but then why is this followed up with the first stage evolutions of those Pokemon? This is the second to last gym, so couldn't you have given a Ninetales or a Charizard or a Magmar for us to face? Finally, we reach Giovanni. This is a really cool surprise the first time, but outside of his annoying spinning tiles puzzle, this gym will be over in a flash. After all that, we head on to the Pokemon League. None of the Elite Four are even remotely memorable for their appearances here, and I loathe the fact that they barely actually specialise in their specific types. I managed to sweep Bruno with my Poliwrath, Agatha with my Sandslash, and had a single Pokemon Fate against Lorelei and 3 against Lance. Blue's Charizard proved to be quite literally the only challenge for me at the Pokemon League despite me being ridiculously underleveled, which leads me to my next section. Everybody talks about the level curve being broken in Gen 2, but the level curve here is almost just as messed up. After you complete Saffron City, you sort of steamroll your way towards the end of the game. Because Kanto was designed to be so open, this means the wild Pokemon you encounter from this point on are actually really low leveled. To put it in perspective, while surfing from Fuchsia to Cinnabar, I encountered level 5 Pokemon. Even in Victory Road, it feels like the Pokemon needed to be beefed up, not only to give me a greater challenge, but also to provide me with an opportunity to level up. I arrived at the Pokemon League 20 levels lower than Blue's strongest Pokemon. I resigned myself to the fact that I would need to grind, but decided to attempt the league just for a laugh. I dominated it. As I mentioned, if it wasn't for Blue's Charizard, I would have breezed past everything despite being so outmatched. Part of the reason why I was able to dominate so easily is the enemy AI logic. There were way too many examples at the Pokemon League alone where I was able to skate on by because my opponents were unfathomably dumb. This kind of AI was present throughout the entire game. It helped me in the optional blue fight at Indigo Plateau, and I was able to sweep Giovanni at Silphco with a single underleveled Ninetales. It was the last Pokemon in my party going up against a ground-type trainer, and yet Giovanni still couldn't pull off a victory. I whited out just 3 times in this playthrough. The first time happened during the gauntlet on the way to Bill's house, as I was way too lazy to heal. The second occurred similarly when I didn't buy more healing items and got a few unfavourable matchups on the way to Vermilion City. And as I mentioned earlier, Koga used Minimize to make sure I could never hit a single move on his Muck. After that loss to Koga, I didn't lose ever again. These games are laughably easy, but they're great at getting under your skin. Because of the overrepresentation of poison types and broken game mechanics, it often feels like Game Freak have designed certain trainers to be a massive pain in the ass. They're not difficult, but they're just a chore to face off against. I'm really going to sound like a Kanto hater at this point, but I do not like Kanto as a region. If you were to describe Johto, you'd talk about the old school Japanese architecture. Hoenn and Sinnoh are marked by their water and mountains respectively. Unova and Alola are creative recreations of mainland America and Hawaii. In short, basically every region seems to have easily identifiable defining characteristics. So what defines Kanto? Flat fields, I guess? There's just not a lot going on in Kanto other than boring plains and boring caves. There are only a handful of landmarks available for you to explore, and of those, only a couple are actually interesting. The genuine standout is the Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island. Not only is the lore about Mew and Mewtwo really freaking cool, but searching through an abandoned mansion filled with thieves and scientists doing experiments creates such an awesome atmosphere. Game Freak really nailed it with Pokemon Mansion, but then you have areas like Diglett Cave, Rock Tunnel, and even the Seafoam Islands which are boring to explore. Even Pokemon Tower takes a cool concept and makes it extremely boring by having you face 2 Pokemon repeatedly. The idea of the Safari Zone is really cool, but tying multiple HMs to it and forcing players to wander around blindly in it is not fun. There are glimpses of brilliance in the region, but they're just few and far between. Having a Snorlax block your path? That's actually a really cool addition to the region. Having to slog through yet another same looking cave is less cool. Something a lot of people know about these days is just how open Kanto is. It's basically an open world game with how much freedom you get here. Under regular circumstances, you can pretty much go anywhere in these games after the second gym and challenge the gyms in whatever order you see fit. However, with the introduction of Pokemon Stadium 2, you could actually break these games open even further. So much so that you could challenge the Saffron City Gym second due to the game's ability to transfer items. It's really cool that you have this sort of freedom, but it also causes major issues. You can tell that Game Freak held back on some of the trainer and wild Pokemon levels so people wouldn't get absolutely crushed if they wander off in the wrong direction. It's the same issue Johto encounters by letting you face the middle gyms in whatever order you want. Ultimately, the open nature doesn't add anything to the game. Most people aren't going to be able to challenge the gyms out of order due to being underleveled, so all it does is create unnecessary issues. This game is a massive hit and miss when it comes to its visuals. The overworld isn't too bad for the most part, only occasionally running into areas where it's confusing to decipher what Game Freak is trying to depict. The water graphics in this game are weirdly hypnotic, and almost come across as one of those trippy visual illusion images that break your brain. Graphically, the biggest issue is the sprites. Oh boy are these an absolute mess. I would say at least 75% of the sprites here are downright hideous to look at. Fun fact, these sprites were actually created before Ken Sugimori made his iconic artwork of the first gen Pokemon, which resulted in a frightening mess of pixels most of the time. There are some solid sprites, such as the ones for Rattata, Onix or Venusaur, but those are the exception. All of the first stage starters, Pidgey, Geodude, Bellsprout, Paris, Goldeen, Machop, Sandslash, Vulpix, Mankey, those are just some of the sprites that will give you nightmares. And if a Pokemon doesn't have a god-awful sprite, they're usually in an extremely weird pose. See Slowpoke, Grimer, or Furo for example. Game Freak honestly have the anime and Ken Sugimori to thank for popularising these creature designs. There is not a single example in this game where I'd take a design over what was showcased in this show or by Sugimori. Game Freak clearly acknowledged that these initial interpretations of the Pokemon weren't great, as they'd redo all of the sprites to look more like Sugimori's art for Pokemon Yellow. While the front-facing sprites are laughably bad, the back sprites are just confusing. Most back sprites are a jumbled mess where you can't tell what's going on. A lot of the fun of catching and using Pokemon goes out the window when all you see is some jumbled pixels when you send it out to do battle. It would be poor form for me to not mention the iconic soundtrack for this game. So many pieces from Red and Blue have been ingrained in the minds of multiple generations of kids. Revisiting them isn't the most pleasant experience, as these tracks have been remade in higher quality many times now. Because of this, it all kinda just sounds like a bunch of bleeps and bloops. However, I can still recognise how well made it was and how influential it was to this very day. And the final aspect we're examining in this marathon review is the post-game content. Now, I'm going to be lenient on this section because they quite literally couldn't fit in any post-game content. Game Freak were only able to fit Mew on the cartridge by removing the debug tools, so having any new places to explore was always out of the question. Still, I have to ding at some points for having almost no post-game content to speak of. All that's left to do after the credits roll is head to Cerulean Cave and catch Mewtwo. This isn't even that big of a deal, because you'll just toss your Master Ball at him and be done with it, as the Master Ball really doesn't have any other use here. You probably also passed over the legendary birds, however because Seafoam Islands and Victory Road are compulsory locations to explore, there is a solid chance you caught 2 of their 3 during the course of the story. After you've encountered the 4 legendaries, the only thing left is to catch every available Pokemon on your cartridge. Depending on whether you were catching Pokemon regularly during the main story, this might not even add much playability to the postgame. Overall, it's a lackluster showing, albeit one that is completely understandable due to their limitations. Because this is the first game in the series, this is obviously going to occupy the #1 slot for the time being. Pokémon Red and Blue are still solid games in 2019, despite how critical I've been. They were filled with flaws that were evident at the time, but have become even more obvious with age and newer entries. However, the characteristic charm of the Pokémon series is present here. While it's a much simpler version of the highest peaks of the series, this is a game that has actually aged rather well, all things considered. I can see Pokémon Red and Blue being games that are revisited forever. They're still accessible, and the more bare-bones approach is a very relaxed way to play a main series Pokémon game. Having said that, I can't see any of the main series games that come after it failing to top the standard that was set here.